Good afternoon. This is the fifth lecture in the course Globalization and Inequality. And today I would like to speak to you about HIV/AIDS. Obviously, we are at the moment in the middle of the scourge of COVID-19, but AIDS is still a major problem in developing countries and particularly Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I've given this lecture a bit of a provocative title, Saving Depraved Africans, criticizing mainstream HIV/AIDS interventions in Sub-Saharan Africa. And as a disclaimer, I want to make clear that obviously I don't see Africans as being depraved, but it is my idea that mainstream interventions have been built around the idea that Africans have a particular sexuality, and I would like to bring in other factors that have caused the AIDS epidemic to be so dominant in Sub-Saharan Africa. Before we go to the HIV/AIDS issues, let's quickly remind ourselves of the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals, but remember, these are not only environmental goals, but they are economic goals, economic sustainability, social goals, social sustainability, and obviously the environmental dimension. In terms of today's lecture, it's important to remember that goal 3 is about good health. There are in total 13 targets, but the target that matters today is by 2030 end the epidemics of AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases. We are now at the end almost of 2020, so in that sense, 9 more years. Today I would like to speak to you about the ABC of HIV/AIDS. It's important to understand the biology and the background of this disease. Context, questions and concerns. Then the mainstream knowledges that are out there and that policies and interventions are based on. And then the relationship with neoliberalism or neoliberal policies in Africa. But before continuing, I think it's important to remember that we are speaking about people like you and me. And here on the screen you see pictures that I took in the village of Thornhill in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. And these are all people affected by HIV/AIDS. The grandmother here is HIV positive with her grandson. He's luckily not affected. The lady here at the bottom, she became deaf due to complications of HIV/AIDS. And Zoleka Jack is at the moment a healthy young woman, but she was on the verge of death a year before I got to know her. And luckily she returned to the village in South Africa with a good clinic, and at that moment in time good access to HIV/AIDS drugs. And she completely regained her health. And when she spoke to me and when I interviewed her, and she told me that she contracted AIDS due to being raped by her stepfather, she said, feel free to use my picture and tell my story to the world. So when we talk about AIDS in Africa, let's remember that these are people of real flesh and blood. Okay, let's look at the ABC of HIV/AIDS. It's important to remember that HIV is a retrovirus, human immune deficiency virus, and it causes AIDS by inserting genetic material into the host cell and turning the host cell into an HIV factory. AIDS itself, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, means that your immune system becomes compromised and you become very susceptible to all kinds of diseases. This is what the medical and biological background looks like. So here is the human cell. You have the HIV virus or the HI virus that infects the cell, inserts its genetic material, and then the cell is turned into an HIV factory. So you yourself start producing viral particles. AIDS itself is the most severe manifestation of infection with HIV. It's associated with numerous opportunistic infections and cancers, and persons living with AIDS frequently suffer debilitating weight loss, diarrhea, and a type of cancer called Kaposi's sarcoma. This is a young woman also in Thornhill who was at the last stage, and she refused to take medication. Kaposi's sarcoma was initially a very rare skin disease, and suddenly all over the US and Europe, young homosexual men turned up at their doctors with this skin disease, and that was the beginning of research into what later became known as HIV/AIDS. CD4 cells play an important role in the disease. CD4 cells are a type of white blood cell, and they generally protect you against infection. And during HIV/AIDS, your CD4 cells are destroyed, and therefore your immune system is destroyed, and that is called immunodeficiency. What is very important is that HIV/AIDS is seen over time, and that we recognize that there are various phases in the disease. The time scale here is somewhat strange because the first time scale is 12 weeks and this is 12 years, so obviously the graph should be much longer. And what you see here is that once a person gets infected, there is a huge spike in terms of viral particles in the body, the dotted line. And that means that in the first 6 weeks, patients are very infectious to other people. The black line here is the immune system, and you see that it dips terribly in those first 6 weeks, but you see a reconstitution after about 12 weeks, and that stays quite constant for, let's say, up to 5, 6, 7 years. And only then begins the body begins to lose its battle, and you see a spike again in the viral particles in the blood, and let's say in healthy individuals, otherwise healthy individuals, the disease can take up to 12 years to be deadly. We should also understand that HIV/AIDS is not curable. So the disease itself is not curable. However, the opportunistic infections that people suffer from can be combated with antibiotics, antifungal medicine, etc. The disease, however, is treatable with antiretroviral medication. And when your CD4 count, these white blood cells, when that count drops below 200, and you get then access to antiretroviral medication, the outcome is generally excellent. So it's also good to remember the goals of this ARV treatment, obviously to prolong life expectancy, but it also helps you to improve the quality of your life. It prevents the development of opportunistic infections and AIDS-related conditions because your immune system stays strong. It encourages immune reconstitution. It suppresses viral replication. So, the rate at which your body produces these viral particles is slowed down tremendously, even until roughly zero. And since there are less particles, viral particles in your blood, you are also not contagious anymore for others. So it prevents, in the end, the transmission of the virus. And so in a population, it's very important that people get access to the medication. Now, this idea of different stages of the disease you also see in a population. So this is a graph from the state of Indiana from the mid-80s to let's say 2004, 2005. And you see the blue curve here are the HIV numbers, so people infected with the virus. And these are the AIDS numbers, so these are people with full-blown AIDS and getting disease. Now this graph is really interesting because it shows us that when the disease was not yet known and doctors started noticing people dying of a strange affliction, namely later termed AIDS, let's say in the early 90s, the numbers of AIDS patients was sharply rising. But at that moment, you saw that the HIV numbers in the population, people infected, was already extremely high. So in a sense, when AIDS was discovered, the damage was already done in the population. Something that is also important to remember is that there is a strange statistical issue that we need to be aware of. Because once we start treating people with ARVs, it means that it actually increases the number of HIV infected people, called HIV prevalence, in a society because people are staying alive. So obviously this is excellent because these HIV positive patients on drugs can lead full lives, they are relatively healthy, they are not contagious to others. But looking at it from a statistical point of view, HIV prevalence, the people having been infected with HIV actually rises in a population. Now what you see here is two pictures of the same young woman. If it's not entirely clear here, then please look at the slides. Here she is very, very sick, suffering from AIDS. And here she is a few months later, really healthy with the same baby after she received ARV treatment. All right, so let's go to context, questions, and certain concerns that we may have. The focus here is on Sub-Saharan Africa, and it is good to understand that AIDS is still a major issue in Africa, and also that when we look at AIDS in the world, it is particularly concentrated in Sub-Saharan Africa. So of the 1.3 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa infected with HIV or who died of HIV, this represented 72% of the global total deaths. So more than 70% of global deaths are found in Sub-Saharan Africa. And when we look at people living with AIDS, it's more than 50% of those people who are living in Eastern and Southern Africa. What we've seen is that in the past decade, maybe 15 years, we've seen that the availability, the more general availability of treatment has also had very good results. And so between 2000 and 2014, 34% fewer AIDS-related deaths in Sub-Saharan Africa. So in that sense, the picture is not all bleak, but still there is lots of suffering and lots of people are dying unnecessarily. In terms of prevalence, HIV prevalence, there are many regions in Sub-Saharan Africa where it is still between 10 and 13%. So if we translate that, for example, to the Dutch situation with a population of 17 million, it means that roughly 1.5 million people would be infected. So in that sense, the situation is still very worrisome in many Sub-Saharan African countries. Also, if you look at life expectancy, let's say at the turn of the millennium, a country where I lived for more than a year, Botswana, saw a life expectancy drop from 63 years to 48. And another thing, and I think that's one of the central things of this lecture that we're trying to explain and grapple with, is that HIV/AIDS in Sub-Saharan Africa is a heterosexual disease. So you see that in the rest of the world it is mainly associated with homosexuality, male homosexuality, and intravenous drug use, that it is relatively rare in the heterosexual communities, but in Sub-Saharan Africa it is seen, not only seen, but it's a heterosexual disease. And this leads to important questions. Namely, why has the heterosexual HIV/AIDS epidemic in Africa been explained by casting Africans as sexually hyperactive and promiscuous? Why is this the main explanation? And what is the relationship between neoliberal policies and ideology when looking at the outbreak and also the severity of the epidemic? So in order to try and find an answer to these questions, I propose to look at three particular approaches to combat HIV/AIDS in Africa. The first two are what we could call mainstream approaches, the biomedical approach and the behavioral approach. And then I will look at a potentially alternative approach called the structural approach. To start with the biomedical approach, I think it's obvious that we are speaking about a disease, and therefore this approach has its roots in biomedicine. And it's logical because HIV/AIDS is a medical condition. It's a syndrome, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, caused by a virus that renders the body vulnerable to opportunistic infections. So it means that the actors involved are particularly medical actors. It is a disease of doctors and patients. The medical institutions are involved, hospitals, clinics, pharmaceutical industry, not to forget, etc. But maybe first, when we talk about HIV/AIDS and when we think about the situation that we are in now with COVID-19, that is transmissible through the air, we can ask ourselves whether HIV/AIDS is contagious. So maybe pause the video for a moment and think about that answer and note down for yourself whether you think it's contagious and to what extent. Now, Stillwagon showed us that transmission of HIV in industrialized countries, let's simplify it by saying the West, has been insufficient to maintain a heterosexual epidemic. So when I was a student in the 1980s, we were warned that the virus would jump from the homosexual and drug user communities into the heterosexual community, and that we would need to be very careful, but that never happened. And it's interesting to ask why. So then let's see how contagious HIV/AIDS actually is. It's not particularly contagious in otherwise healthy communities. Female to male transmission is between 1 in 700 to 1 in 3,000. So this you could translate to sexual encounters. Male to female transmission is a little bit more is easier, and then male to male transmission is the easiest. Why is it easier for men to infect women than for women to infect men? It's HIV/AIDS is being spread by bodily fluids, and if people don't use a condom, it means that the male fluids stay inside the woman, and therefore there's a larger surface area, and there's more time for the viral particles to infect the woman. That's why male to female is more efficient. Male to male transmission is about anal sex and the fact that ruptures can take place, and therefore this is a relatively efficient way of transmitting the disease. So let's remember again this particular curve, and also let's remember that there is this spike in the first 6 weeks when people hardly feel that they are infected. They've got flu-like symptoms. But something else is that there is a strong correlation with other diseases, and that is what we'll focus on in this lecture. STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, tuberculosis, and tropical infections. Now, we are still talking about the biomedical approach, and therefore let's also look at some of the successes of that approach. First and foremost, opportunistic infections can be now effectively fought and kept under control, as I said, with antibiotics, etc. The virus itself can be suppressed for many, many years through these ARVs, also called highly active antiretroviral therapy. And this was an amazing occurrence in Europe and the United States, because from the mid to late 90s, the visible horrors of AIDS almost disappeared. And there are, high-profile figures in our societies. For example, there is a lawyer that's regularly in the news in the Netherlands, giving his opinion on legal affairs. And he was diagnosed with HIV/AIDS in the early 90s, and since the mid-90s received ARVs and is leading a healthy and productive life. So what we can say is, it's become a chronic illness in the rich parts of the world. And there are now even new developments. For example, this PrEP pill You can take it when you want to go party and you don't want to protect yourself. You're willingly exposing yourself to unsafe sex. Um, and it costs about €7,000 per person per year. This, the fact that people who were suffering and dying of HIV/AIDS, or in the last stages of HIV/AIDS, received the drugs in the late 90s. Some have described this as the Lazarus effect, Jesus rising out of the grave. And one high-profile figure, a South African High Court judge who also came to Maastricht once to give a lecture about his experience, said when he received the drugs, he was on the verge of death. He couldn't go to the toilet anymore. He was in bed 24/7. And he said there was only one word for it. It was glorious. The drugs were working. I could feel that I was getting healthy again. So in that sense, huge success with the availability of these drugs. Also, the prevention of mother-to-child transmission. When you give a woman about to give birth for a few weeks access to these drugs, it means that the chances that the baby gets infected during birth is severely reduced. So that's also one of the successes of the biomedical approach. All right, then we go to the second mainstream approach, the behavioral approach, that has its roots in psychology and public health and behavioral science. It's an emphasis on the modes of transmission of AIDS, and the idea is that by changing our behavior, we can avoid the spread of AIDS in a community. So it's particularly focused on sexual behavior, but also on, for example, needle sharing. The most well-known approach, or the most well-known naming of the approach, is the ABC approach: abstinence, A; be faithful, B; and C, the use of condoms. And then there is, of course, avoiding dirty needles, etc. So this has been a kind of fundamental mantra to HIV interventions all over the world. Now, the fact that AIDS, COVID, is obviously much more dangerous in the sense that it's airborne, and that just by speaking to someone or singing together, people can get infected. But the fact that AIDS was associated with sexual behavior led to the fact that it became taboo, and that taboo and stigma played a large role in the way the disease was understood, but also the way the disease was dealt with. Susan Sontag, a very progressive social scientist, said in her important work, AIDS became associated with indulgence, delinquency, addictions to chemicals that are illegal, and to sex regarded as deviant and perverse. So this was not her opinion, but she noticed that in the public domain, that is how people spoke about this disease. Drug use, homosexuality, etc. And this was also something that religious authorities used in their sermons. So someone like Jerry Falwell, a well-known preacher in the US, said, AIDS is God's judgment on a society that does not live by his rules. Something else that we saw is that the disease became blended with negative stereotypes about migrants, particularly third world migrants. So this was let's say late 90s of the 20th century was a period when there were major crises on Haiti, and therefore Haiti boat refugees tried to cross to the US. And when these refugees were picked up, they were detained in Guantanamo. And Guantanamo at that time did not have the detention center for Muslim fighters, but at that time Haitian refugees were parked there, so to say, and it was looked at whether they were contagious or not, and were infected with AIDS. The situation on Guantanamo at that time was very worrisome and traumatic for many of the migrants. And here is a news clip from the BBC. Just check it out when you look at the slides. And then here you see an excerpt from the migration policies in the US. And if you were HIV positive, you could not get access to the US until, I think, 2010, when Obama got rid of that policy. The behavioral approach also led to success. There were successful interventions, particularly when these communities became involved themselves in fighting the disease and speaking about the disease in their own among their own peers. So there were awareness campaigns, for example, safe sex campaigns for and by homosexual men, run by gay organizations in the Netherlands, were very successful in order to promote safe sex. Something that was very controversial in the world, but rather successful in the Netherlands, were these so-called needle exchange programs, so that drug users were not sharing needles, but could get clean needles to inject themselves, and that really helped to curb the epidemic. And there was widespread condom distribution, for example, for sex workers, which was also relatively controversial in the world. And there's then the accusation that you are promoting deviancy, that you're promoting promiscuity and prostitution, etc. This behavioral paradigm, this behavioral approach, became one of the central pillars of dealing with AIDS in Africa. And this is a quote from a 2006 UNAIDS report that shows you how central this thinking about sexuality, and particularly African sexuality, was at that time. It reads, especially in settings with high HIV prevalence, effective HIV prevention often requires changes to deep-seated traditions and social norms regarding human sexuality. Given the important role of concurrent unprotected sexual partnerships in the spread of HIV in Sub-Saharan Africa, persuading sexually active individuals to accept partner reduction and monogamy as valued norms may be critical to prevention efforts. So here you see that one of the most mainstream institutions in fighting HIV/AIDS, UNAIDS, saw African sexuality and African promiscuity, multiple partners, as something of an African character. To my mind, very controversial idea. and that there was a need, according to UNAIDS, to change norms and sexual behavior in Africa. So, in other words, according to UNAIDS, there were elements of an exceptional sexuality in Africa that needed to be dealt with by outside intervention. Now, Stillwagon, important scholar on HIV/AIDS and a critical scholar on HIV/AIDS, said that this focus on African sexuality to explain the epidemic was highly problematic, and that our knowledge of African sexuality was extrapolated from only a few ethnographic studies, and that according to her this was problematic. And she said, by framing AIDS in Africa as resulting from an exotic and exceptional sexuality, it meant that research became much too focused on sexual behavior, and therefore also defined appropriate ways to deal with the epidemic. And as a consequence, these mainstream AIDS policy interventions focusing on sexuality ignored other extensive research findings, namely findings that linked HIV/AIDS to poverty-related diseases and conditions. And I think that's the central message of this lecture today, is that obviously sexual behavior plays a role in transmission, but if we focus too much on this and ignore poverty and poverty-related circumstances, then the fight against HIV/AIDS is highly problematic. So in an interesting paper, Source and Stillwagon said the following. They argued that the scholars of the concurrency hypothesis, namely those who believed that Africans had much more concurrent relationships, or were much more promiscuous than other people in the world, according to them, these scholars have actually failed to establish that this is unusually prevalent in Africa. So what they are saying is they don't believe, they don't see the evidence that Africans are more promiscuous than, let's say, people in the Netherlands, academics in Maastricht, students in the United States, etc. And according to Source and Stillwagon, therefore, policymakers should turn their attention to the real drivers of African HIV epidemics that are policy sensitive and based on real epidemiological evidence. And there are some studies on what we could call global sexuality, where there is a comparison of sexuality in different parts of the world. And one of the interesting findings in this study is that it is actually married people that have the most sex, and that sexual activity in young single people tends to be more sporadic and is more prevalent in industrialized countries rather than in developing countries. Also, this study finds that monogamy is still the dominant pattern in most regions, and that it's particularly men that report multiple partnerships, and they brag about the amount of partners they have, and much less common in women. And also multiple partnerships are generally, according to this study, more common in developed countries rather than in developing countries. And single men and women in many African countries are, according to this study, fairly sexually inactive, with 2/3 reporting recent sexual activity compared with 3/4 in industrialized countries. Now, obviously, there might be lots to say about this study too, but maybe when we reflect on our own situation, maybe there is not much difference when we look at academics in Africa or academics in Latin America or academics in Asia in terms of their sexuality, in terms of the type of relationships they have, in terms of how many times people cheat on their partners, etc. And maybe you can say the same for students all over the world. So we've looked at the biomedical approach, we looked at the behavioral approach, and now let's look at, let's incorporate some of these lessons and look at what we call the structural approach. And the question at hand is, how do we explain the fact that the affluent are relatively unaffected and, if affected, survive, while it is particularly the poor everywhere that are suffering and dying of HIV/AIDS? And although this lecture has a focus on AIDS, I think we see and saw also in the course already that we can ask similar questions to COVID-19. Why is it that the poor and vulnerable are particularly affected by COVID rather than those who are more affluent? So here we come to the important work of Paul Farmer. You also see some of his books above. It's the Pathologies of Power book. Here is a picture of him. Obviously you have watched the documentary Bending the Arc, so you're already familiar with his groundbreaking work and those around him and the partners that in Haiti that he worked with to set up these very successful health interventions. Now, Farmer is an anthropologist, he's an academic, he's an activist, he's a medical doctor, so he has an authority to speak. And what he talks about in the Pathologies of Power book is the pathogenic effects of inequality. In other words, inequality makes people sick. And according to him, the distribution of AIDS is strikingly localized and non-random. So it's found in particular places among particular people. And therefore he coins the term structural violence against the poor and defenseless. So there are structures out there, economic, cultural, and societal structures that cause people to be more sick than others. And therefore, when we analyze the disease and we think about the solutions, it's important to take into account poverty and inequality. According to Nana Poku, poverty structures not only the contours of the pandemic, but also the outcome once an individual is sick with complications of HIV infection. And maybe this is a quote that we could also use when we talk about COVID. Yet the dominant interventions, HIV/AIDS interventions, are embedded in a wider ideological hegemony of neoliberalism. And this ideology has a particular emphasis on cost effectiveness and individual sexual behavior. So here you see this enmeshing of these two types of ways of looking at the disease. One is that always the first question to ask is, is it cost effective to intervene in a certain manner? So it's not human rights as a point of departure, but costs. And second, that we focus on individual sexual behavior rather than societal structural issues. So that's why these critical scholars see what they call an hegemonic response. The biomedical approach and behavioral approach have strongly shaped mainstream understandings and interventions that match the neoliberal agenda by focusing predominantly on the individual. So the explanation is that this disease is dominant in the world, and it spreads because of the irresponsible behavior of individuals. So it's not due to these societal structural factors, but it's about irresponsible individual behavior. And what we also see is that there is a tendency to depoliticize the disease. It's similar to what you hear when in the COVID crisis, that scholars and politicians say this disease affects us all equally. These critical scholars say no, there is a tendency to depoliticize the disease. And certainly when we look at Africa, we see that second and third generation ARVs, the most modern and well developed medical solutions, are available for the affluent wherever they live. And then this ABC approach, abstinence, be faithful, and condomize, is particularly suited for poor people. And even home-based care for the poor. So we as whites, think about the white gaze in development, we go to Africa to tell Africans to change their sexuality and then to tell them to care for each other, to set up home-based care as interventions. In other words, we don't make available the medication. We say that is too expensive, but refrain from sex, be faithful, use condoms, and once you get sick, care for each other at home. And this depoliticization you also see in the sense that health budgets in governments are seen as something separate from other budgets. So what you saw in South Africa at a time when the South African government said we don't have money to fight HIV/AIDS, they purchased submarines for the Ministry of Defense. So these are clearly political choices. So how do we deal with the poor, according to Paul Farmer? Paul Farmer is really inspired by liberation theology from Latin America, and he urges us to not make sure that the poor get equally good treatment, but since the disease and since the issues of HIV/AIDS are so present in poor areas and in poor communities, he actually demands preferential treatment for the poor. So this is something that Paul Farmer emphasizes. Now I think it's important to go into the ecology of poverty, to look at the work of Eileen Stillwagon in her very important book, AIDS and the Ecology of Poverty, where she tries to explain the issues from a biological and epidemiological point of view. So what she wants to understand is why the heterosexual epidemic that hardly occurred in the West was so omnipresent in Sub-Saharan Africa. And she looked at the biological factors and ecological factors explaining that. So according to her, the first thing that we need to consider is the the cofactor issue, namely that sexually transmitted diseases are a cofactor in transmitting HIV. But she says there are important poverty-related conditions that are often not mentioned. And she wants us to also look at malnutrition, malaria, worms. This is not going to be a very pleasant topic, and schistosomiasis or bilharzia. So let's look at these consecutively and start with STDs. So STDs are a very important cofactor for HIV transmission, particularly in malnourished people in Africa and similar poor populations in Asia. It is these sexually transmitted diseases that cause genital ulcers, vaginal and urethral discharge, for example, syphilis, chancroid, gonorrhea, chlamydia, etc. So what you can hopefully imagine is that once you have a sexually transmitted disease and this disease creates lesions in the genital area, that the transmission of the viral particles is so much easier. So in that sense, having sex when you both have a sexually transmitted disease, you only need to have sex, let's say, once or twice or 3 times in order for the human immune deficiency virus to be transmitted to the other person. So instead of a transmission of 1 in 700 or 1 in 3000, it becomes 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 or 1 in 4. But there are other factors that we need to look at, and these are called the poverty-related cofactors. And let's start with malnutrition. Now, when a person is malnourished, it means that the skin becomes brittle, and the mucous membranes are also strongly affected, and they are much more vulnerable. They become thinner, and they are much more vulnerable for being compromised. Now, if we then realize that in the period when AIDS became widespread in Africa, from let's say the mid-80s to the late 90s, this was a moment in Sub-Saharan history when 30% of the population of the region was malnourished. So it tremendously increased the vulnerability of these populations to infectious and parasitic diseases. And therefore, once infected by these diseases, they also became, let's say, the sexual and vertical transmission of HIV became so much easier. So that's malnutrition as an important cofactor. The second cofactor is malaria. Here you see the malaria endemic areas of the world, and it's particularly also Sub-Saharan Africa that is highlighted. And looking at epidemiological numbers, it shows that models of malaria-HIV interaction estimate a 3-fold increase in HIV transmission in malaria endemic populations. In other words, once people are sick with malaria, they become more prone to HIV. And then there is this very worrying slide on worms, and it's not particularly pleasant. Worms are generally ignored in our analysis of the spread of AIDS in developing countries. Lymphatic filariasis, a particular worm, affects 40 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa. Helminthic infections, a term for a variety group of worms, are very widespread in developing countries and virtually omnipresent in shanty towns, slums, and rural communities. When we look at the numbers worldwide, 1.5 billion people are infected with ascariasis, 1.3 billion people are infected with hookworm. Here you see hookworm being removed from a foot. And then there are more than 1 billion people infected with trichuriasis. And these infections with worms compromise the immune system and also make people more vulnerable to being infected with HIV. Then there is another omnipresent disease, bilharzia, also called schistosomiasis, and it's particularly urinary bilharzia that is found in the urinary tract of men and women that afflicts 200 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa. And it enables HIV transmission in much the same way as sexually transmitted diseases. It is acquired in contaminated lakes and streams. I had the pleasure myself to be infected with bilharzia in the 1980s just by swimming in a Zambian lake. And it infects the reproductive tracts of both men and women. It creates lesions and inflammation of the genital area. And just like the sexually transmitted diseases, therefore, through these wounds in the genital area, the infection and the transmission of HIV becomes very efficient. So again, like, instead of having sex multiple times before getting infected, only once or twice having sex with a person with lesions can lead to infection. So according to Stillwagon, it is these poverty-related factors that we need to take into account much more. And it is in fact misguided and dangerous when we only focus on the behavioral message on AIDS in Africa. People do not have a particular sexuality, exceptional sexuality. No, it's these poverty factors that we need to take into account. Obviously, behavior does have an impact, but if we want to deal with HIV/AIDS in Sub-Saharan Africa, we need to take into account poverty eradication programs. And the following slides I received from Eileen Stillwagon when we met at a conference in Brazil. And it's a bit provocative, but I think it's important to share this with you. So according to Stillwagon, when we look at risky behavior, it's not early initiation of sex, it's not about premarital sex, it's not about extramarital sex, it's not about unprotected sex, it's not about alcohol use in sex, and it's not about concurrent sexual relationships, or otherwise called promiscuity. No, she has defined, based on her poverty research, other risky behaviors. And again, these are her slides. Risky behavior is living with mosquitoes. Risky behavior is living with disease vectors. Risky behavior is living with soil-transmitted worms. Risky behavior is washing your clothes in a stream with schistosomiasis, bilharzia. Risky behavior is living in and fishing in lakes with schistosomiasis. Risky behavior is living around poor sanitation. Risky behavior is attending clinics that have no medicine. So, although a little bit provocative, this is kind of showing you that risky behavior can be defined in a different manner. Now, one topic that might still be on the table that we need to look at is the issue of gender. And Stillwagon is certainly not someone who will say we need to ignore the important issues of violence, sexual violence, for example, or that we need to ignore the inheritance practices that make sure that women stay poor or don't have access to the inheritance once their husband dies of HIV/AIDS. But her interesting message is that it's also these mundane risks of gendered household tasks that we need to take into account, such as we saw previously, the washing of clothes or gathering reeds in rivers and lakes. And so there are particular tasks in the household that are generally done by women, and through these tasks, women are more susceptible to HIV. Again, there have been studies around focusing, for example, on fisher folk and car washers working and standing in lake water, and there were conclusions that there were these unobserved sexual networks at play, etc. But according to Stillwagon again, it is this fresh water and the fact that in this fresh water people get contaminated with bilharzia that increased HIV transmission, and it was not about these unobserved sexual networks, according to her. So where does this leave us? It means that we have to look at the potential of human rights and human rights-based approaches, and that we need to take social and economic rights at face value, and that we should consider how crucial they are. So according to Paul Farmer, the struggle for access to a basic goods such as primary health care is about really saving and fundamentally improving lives of the poor. If there is a small clinic close to where you live, where you can be treated for sexually transmitted diseases, for worms, and when in the last instance you can have access to antiretroviral medication, that means that people can stay healthy and can survive. All right, that was, let's say, the basics of AIDS in Sub-Saharan Africa, where my argument is that we should approach it from a poverty point of view, and that is crucial when we want to deal with AIDS in Africa without only focusing on sexual behavior. The interventions have been largely shaped by neoliberalism, and I just want to provide a few remarks on AIDS and neoliberalism in Africa to end this lecture. So the question that we need to ask is what impact did neoliberal policies have on the outbreak and severity of the epidemic, and how did neoliberal ideology influence our understanding and our interventions? And why has this HIV/AIDS industry cast African victims particularly as being promiscuous and hypersexual? Now, most of you are familiar with neoliberalism, political and economic doctrine, looking at particularly individual property rights, free markets, free trade. It has become consolidated over the past 3-4 decades. It has thoroughly transformed our economic, political, and ideological world. Look at the way a university nowadays is organized. We see the market has really penetrated academia. It's an ideology that has emerged under Thatcher and Reagan in the early 1980s. It's all about the so-called rational and isolated individual as a fundamental unit of society. And particularly in developing countries, we saw the so-called structural adjustment programs where governments were forced by the IFIs, the international financial institutions, to enforce budget cuts in health and education. So neoliberalism provides the context for the interventions, making cost effectiveness very, very central to interventions in developing countries, and therefore also a large focus on prevention, these behavioral interventions, and also individual self-help and empowerment programs. So what are some of the main actors that we need to look at when we talk about neoliberalism and AIDS? The institutions like IMF and World Bank, the dominance of the pharmaceutical industry and the marketing and profit making in terms of the medication. So it's the best medication that is available for those who can pay, who can afford it, and generally this medication is not available for those who need it the most. What we should also understand is that aid and Western policies have been influenced in many cases by religious Christian conservatism, and therefore this focus on abstinence and focused on being faithful. And fourthly, what is clear in the past decades is the role of private actors. Particularly charities have become quite dominant actors in the fight against HIV/AIDS, rather than thinking and coming up with collective, more structural solutions. So an example of this charity is Product Red, which I'll briefly speak about. So if we look at the structural adjustment programs, less state, also in health and education, what we see in Zambia, a country in Sub-Saharan Africa, is that, and these are the reported cases in Zambia of HIV/AIDS. It doesn't matter that these cases are relatively low, because recording of health cases in Zambia has not been done very well. But what is important is that we see that AIDS emerged in the 80s and then increased over the next decades. So what we saw in Sub-Saharan Africa is this explosion of an HIV/AIDS epidemic, and it's particularly in this area that, due to the debt crisis, the IFIs forced African governments to implement structural adjustment programs. So these countries were dealing with the worst health crisis in history until that time, and the outside agencies, development agencies, IMF, World Bank, forced them to spend less on health and education. So this was very unfortunate, and therefore the statistics of Zambia after more than 10 years of structural adjustment programs were disastrous. So if you look at the 2006 indicators for Zambia, life expectancy at birth had dropped to 40 years. 1.1 million people living with HIV. In terms of Human Development Index, the country had dropped to place 166. Almost 90% of people lived on less than $2 a day. And then the last figure is maybe even the most shocking figure, is that the per capita government expenditure in Zambia on health is $26. Not $26 a day, not $26 a week, but $26 a year. In other words, the Zambian government has $26 per person available for health interventions. And someone like Stephen Lewis, a scholar and at one point a UN envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa, produced a series of lectures. You can listen to them. He produced a book, Race Against Time. And in this book, he shows his outrage, and he says these countries were forced into a macroeconomic straitjacket. And a country like Malawi, which borders Zambia, he was involved in the negotiations between the World Bank and IMF and the Malawi government, and he was pushing for giving the Malawi government much more leeway to deal with the disease. And he said, the World Bank and IMF simply did not respond to the arguments which begged them to review the human consequences of their policies. It was a form of capitalist Stalinism. And looking at the Malawi case, he said, Malawi government wanted to invest in health and education because that is where the issues were once AIDS became such a tremendous burden. But the IMF wouldn't allow them to do so. And we are talking about a sovereign government fighting the worst plague in history with a handful of professionals. So he was completely outraged that this took place. Besides these IFIs, there is another actor that is dominant when we talk about HIV/AIDS, and that is the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry has kept prices high, has made sure that the medication was for a long time unaffordable for Africans. And in the late 1990s, for example, drug companies kept the price of medication due to patent rights at roughly $10,000 per AIDS patient for the South African Health Service. Now, after years and years of lobbying and fighting, the transnational activism in 2018, the situation was that the price of state-of-the-art HIV drugs became available for Africans for $75 per person per year. So this is, let's say, between late 1990s, roughly 20 years struggle for the price of AIDS medication. It meant that the price came down from $10,000 per AIDS patient to $75 per AIDS patient. The other worrying thing is the increased role of private actors and private funding. So instead of looking at AIDS from a human rights perspective, celebrities and charities have become dominant actors. And obviously this is problematic from a human rights perspective, because why should the poor be dependent on the coincidental presence of a charity in their geographic area and be dependent on the goodwill of others when they have a right to health? So imagine that if you would live in Maastricht, you would have access to HIV/AIDS drugs because there is an NGO in the city. And if you would go to IJsden, a village to the south, you wouldn't have access to AIDS medication because the NGO is not present there. So citizens in a country are dependent on international donors or international NGOs or local NGOs for access to drugs, and that's of course highly problematic. What we also see, and that is something Garrett puts on the table, is what we can call a democratic deficit in many health projects. These are often executed by foreign NGOs operating with almost no government interference inside weak or failed states, and therefore the poor have virtually no provisions to say what they want, and what they want need to decide which particular projects these serve their needs. In other words, many NGOs do good work, but the decisions about what work and what projects are often not taken by the local people themselves. And governments have very little influence. Sometimes international NGOs are stronger and have more political power than the government on which territory they function. And that is a problem, and that is also part of the neoliberal world we live in. And I think this is an excellent example of one of these charities, Product Red. I think it still exists. So you buy a red version of a luxury good, and part of the profit goes to buying AIDS medication for poor people. And I think the initial statement that was used by Bono when he launched this initiative, I think shows us the worrying elements of the neoliberal world we live in. If you buy a red product from Gap, Motorola, Armani, Converse, or Apple, they will give up to 50% of their profit to buy AIDS drugs for mothers and children in Africa. Red is the consumer battalion gathering in the shopping malls. You buy the jeans, the phones, the iPods, the shoes, the sunglasses, and somebody's mother, father, daughter, or son will live instead of dying in the poorest part of the world. It's a different kind of fashion statement. So what this says is that we, the affluent, should continue shopping, and by shopping we are buying or making available some medication for poor people in the world. And I think this embodies everything that is wrong with such an initiative. We're not looking for a structural solution. We're not approaching this from a human rights perspective, but we are providing charity and continuing our destructive shopping practices. All right, let's see what we can conclude from this lecture. It seems corny, but I want to say it anyway. Africans are human beings too, and they deserve proper treatment and access to health facilities, to drugs, to clinics, and to basic health. I think it's important that we stress human rights versus intellectual property rights, so the rights of AIDS patients rather than the rights of pharmaceutical companies to set prices. And I think it's important that we ask, who is bearing the brunt of the financial crisis and many of the health crises that we face as human beings. The heterosexual HIV/AIDS epidemic in Africa is complex and should be contextualized, and we should recognize that poverty and poverty-related conditions play a huge role, and a much bigger role than we imagined before, and that there should be less emphasis on individual sexual behavior. We should also recognize that the state has a crucial role to play and that we should do everything to strengthen health systems rather than focus on individual diseases and individual behavior. We should therefore endorse, in my view, a structural approach, and that we fight for development processes that really tackle poverty and inequality, and that we avoid remedial measures that dehumanize the poor. We would need to strive for fundamentally changing the power balance in the world by altering and democratizing the dominant development institutions like the IFIs, and we should recognize the importance of a human rights-based approach. The poor should not be helped by the affluent. Also think about the white gaze in development, but should have a right to a fair share of the world's resources. And I would like to end with this picture again from Thornhill. This is the HIV/AIDS group, women, men, children, all infected with HIV/AIDS. And I think we should keep these people in mind when we think about the issues and the solutions for the epidemic. Thanks very much. It was a pleasure, and I hope that it was enlightening and that you will consider poverty as an important factor in HIV/AIDS. See you.